Okay, floor is open. Question or comment? Mustafa Muharram. The mics are coming around. Please identify yourself and then fire away.
Randy, I was surprised you picked out in China and left out the country that even the Fed acknowledges probably among the developed countries has intervened most systematically over the longest period of time in Japan. Any comment on that?
Well, first of all, I do wish to say that I think the Peterson Institute suffers less from stovepiping in these issue areas, and the reason for this is Fred. Fred does a really good job making sure that people draw the connections between their areas of specialization within the institute, and writes on both sides of this divide himself. On Japan, there are not every problem in international finance, not every issue of international balance of payments adjustment can be addressed by the manipulation provisions in U.S. law. Now, Japan, whatever we might think about its exchange rate, hasn't been intervening for about 5 years. And unless we can detect some other way in which the Japanese government would be acting in order to keep the yen undervalued, to block payments adjustment, then I don't think that we can designate Japan for currency manipulation. There are other avenues, bilateral discussions, approaches within the G7, and so forth. And coordinated intervention if we think that the yen is undervalued. But as far as manipulation, I don't think that Japan is an appropriate designee.
No, that's true today, but historically Japan is probably the worst in terms of intervening in currency markets.
Yeah, so Randy, I would reinforce that by saying you've been very forthright in saying that China should be designated now. Do you believe Japan should have been designated back when it was intervening very heavily back in the earlier part of this decade?
That's an interesting question. With respect to these individual countries, I want to go back and look at the data pretty carefully, but the way I've constructed these two baskets, intervention, massive, sustained, unidirectional, Japan came pretty close in 2003 to meeting these criteria. Now, I do define this as over the medium term, right? And so intervention for 4-5 quarters may not quite constitute kind of the medium term. But if Japanese intervention had persisted for 2 or 3 years at those magnitudes, then I would say definitely Japan would be it would have been appropriate to designate in that case.
Okay, yeah, right here, Arturo, and then Al, and then up here.
I happen to agree.
Please identify.
Arturo Porzekanski, colleague at American University. I happen to agree with your analysis and your recommendations, but I have a practical complexity to bring up. The dollar is like a falling knife that almost nobody wants to catch. So there are literally dozens of countries that would qualify as currency manipulators as far as I'm concerned. It's not just China. First of all, it's all the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, and India all have been building up their reserves and is the oil exporters. It's the non-oil commodity exporters. There are literally dozens of countries that have had to, for the past several years, been trying to minimize the appreciation of their currencies vis-a-vis the dollar. So I just wonder, practically speaking, if you started down this road, where would you end?
Well, my brief answer there's the brief answer and there's the long answer, okay? The brief answer is the real serious problem right now is China, okay? If you look through the countries kind of that you've mentioned, I think Russia had been skirting a designation kind of by my criteria up until recently, but increased government spending and increased inflation, in Russia seem to be reducing its current account surplus. I think Norway, is an oil exporter, a large surplus, but it has a flexible exchange rate and is not intervening. I think we see, we can look at Taiwan, we can look at Hong Kong. I think there are exculpatory kind of factors in each of those circumstances. Malaysia and Singapore are a little bit more difficult because they, for various reasons, Singapore has a large current account surplus relative to GDP. It has very large reserves. Although it had been intervening it's been intervening for some time, it had not until recently been sterilizing the effect of those interventions. But now, my understanding is that it is, and so kind of that raises kind of serious questions. Malaysia has its exchange rate has moved very closely with the renminbi. It has its reserves have been rising by $20 billion a year, but there is also capital outflow from Malaysia. I don't fault Treasury for not citing kind of Malaysia yet, but I think issuing a warning is an appropriate thing to do. Neither of these countries kind of really rises to the level of significance as anywhere close, to the level of significance as does China. I think China is the really serious problem. Now, the position of the oil exporters, is an interesting problem. I think it's certainly true that these countries would clearly benefit from appreciation. It would serve global adjustment, and it's perverse that Saudi Arabia should be following the dollar down in the face of its external surpluses and cutting its interest rates. If oil prices, my position on the oil exporters is that if oil prices remain high over time rather than fall back again, and if an appreciation would help raise imports and absorption, then kind of the case for manipulation designation for these countries rises over time. But no, not I don't think yet a designation for manipulation would be justified. It's mainly a China problem.
Al? Go over the mic.
Right. This is the report given the season we're in. I'm economist at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from 2002 to 2004. Is this on?
Yeah, but speak into it.
That worked? Yeah. I'm Albert Keidel, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from 2002 to 2004. I helped manage and manage the Asia office at the Treasury Department when this whole issue came to a boil. And I was also privileged to be at an earlier review of this report here earlier this year, in which a number of issues were raised. And my questions have to do with some of the points raised at that meeting that still don't seem to have been addressed by the report. I think, as many of you know, my overarching view of the China currency issue is that there are powerful forces, much more powerful than price effects, that are causing shifts in China's external balances. And so to focus on just the price effects is at best unfortunate, and in this political climate perhaps quite dangerous. And I'm very aware of the political environment in which this whole issue has come to the fore. Criticisms in the aftermath of the recession early in this decade that jobs were lost due to China. And therefore the simplistic idea was that its currency must be undervalued because the bilateral surplus with the United States was so large at the time. It took quite a while to get people to focus on the fact that the global surplus was very small. In 2004, when China was trying to dampen down overheating and its imports therefore weakened, you had a trade surplus opening up. But there are a number of scholars and experts, including, I think, the former head of this institution's professional advisory body, who are not in agreement with a slam dunk conclusion that China's currency is manipulated for trade advantage and should therefore be subject to some kind of remedial action. And yet, on page 48 in the report, when you lay out the arguments in favor of citing China for manipulation almost entirely by members of this institute, there's no mention of any of the other arguments that might balance that analysis. It's just a one-sided presentation of the very widespread discussion on the status of the Chinese currency. So my first question is, why have you left out so many analyses from well-considered professionals and academics that run contrary to the strong conclusion here that when a country intervenes massively in one direction over several years while running ever larger external surpluses and accumulating unprecedented quantities of foreign reserves, a sophisticated model is not needed. China's case, model uncertainty would be a transparent excuse for failure to designate for manipulation. In other words, that's just saying that there is really no contest in the analysis here, even though many analysts have made strong arguments that counter the ones that you cite. So my first question is, why have you left those out? The second that I'm concerned about is in your recommendations, and this is now on page 90. You say that U.S. legislation should follow the IMF guidelines for exchange rate policy. And then you summarize that when intervention is large-scale, is protracted over 2 or 3 years, is consistently in one direction, and perpetuates or accentuates a current account imbalance, this should alone qualify as manipulation. So that is your recommendation to our legislative bodies about what they should write into the law. And you use as your authority the IMF guidelines. When in fact, this is an old kind of sleight of hand spin on what the IMF has always said. It has not maintained what you maintain it says here. If you go to page 112, where you helpfully put the most recent guidelines, the IMF said these are developments which would require a thorough review and might indicate the need for discussion with a member. Now, that was similar to what was in the 1977 regulation. It doesn't say these are proof positive of manipulation, and then it goes through the kinds of things that you mentioned. But there are reasons to take a very good look. And I would say that's what the legislation should say, that when we see these conditions, Treasury should take a close look. But I don't think the kinds of things that you recommend on page 90 should go into legislation, because they tie the hands of agents that are able to look at, like the Treasury, agencies able to look at the real complexity of these situations. And in light of the uncertainty of the economic analysis, which you really haven't put in here, I think that's even more to be recommended to our Congress. And so my two questions are, why is there sort of a dearth of alternative opinions about the condition of the Chinese currency, and why this sort of spin on quoting the IMF in ways that, in fact, aren't exactly precise?
Well, taking those in order, I guess I didn't need to worry that there wouldn't be any controversy on this point at this meeting. The reason why I don't go through all of the twists and turns in the debate over the valuation, the degree of undervaluation of renminbi, is because this subject was extensively addressed in a book which is about an inch and a half thick, published by the Institute a month ago. And that covers the debate in great detail, and I refer you to that, and I refer to that book in my own. My own book is not specifically about the Chinese economy and the Chinese development strategy. And so I thought it was, my judgment was that it was sufficient and appropriate for me to take the conclusions that I draw from that debate, kind of citing those people appropriately. On the second question, before we get to the second question, this thing about model uncertainty, okay, really is a vexing problem. There is model uncertainty. But as I've said, I think in the case where we have a massive intervention in the foreign exchange market, which keeps the exchange rate lower than it otherwise would, when the current account surplus is growing to 11, maybe 12% of GDP in the case of China, we don't need a model to tell us that the currency is, first of all, undervaluated, and that government action is blocking payments adjustment. Okay, so in that case, model uncertainty is a smokescreen for a failure to find a designation. It's not. Model uncertainty is relevant to other questions. If, for example, we wanted to identify precisely the undervaluation of the currency, we would have to use a model in order to do that. And Bill Klein and John Williamson's contribution to that book, Debating China's Exchange Rate Policy, looks at these different models and evaluates them. I find kind of the model that Williamson and Klein use to be the most persuasive, that type of model. Now, so I think that model uncertainty is something of a red herring, at least for part of this discussion. Secondly, I don't actually say that in this book that the rules of the International Monetary Fund are what I am recommending for U.S. legislation. So that doesn't characterize, that's not a fair characterization of this book. In fact, there are differences between what I am recommending for U.S. policy and what the guidelines that are listed for that the IMF has listed as guidelines for surveillance of exchange rate policy. I think the differences are not major. I think what I'm recommending for the U.S. is faithful kind of to the purposes and objectives of the International Monetary Fund in combating manipulation that prevents balance of payments adjustment. Okay, it leads to some interesting questions as to what would happen. I think a more important question is what would happen if under one set of rules for the United States and another slightly different kind of set of rules, at least as interpreted, for the International Monetary Fund. What would happen if we have different findings with respect to a country on manipulation? I think that if the U.S. acts against a country for manipulation, it really has to be able to argue that it is either defending the International Monetary Fund rules when the executive board is unwilling to act, or that it's defending the international monetary system when the IMF's rules are inadequate for doing so. Now, it's important to remember that the U.S. did designate countries for manipulation in 1988 and 1992, and the IMF did not. Okay, and this was no tragedy. There is wariness. It's interesting. When I was speaking with people here in Washington. I think the detected awareness on the part of both the U.S. government and the IMF to being too consistent. People, some in the United States, were worried about serving as the policeman for the rules of the multilateral system, whereas some in the International Monetary Fund were worried about appearing to be a lapdog for the United States. Both of these people would have liked to have seen more differences between the U.S. and the International Monetary Fund to avoid kind of these problems. But I think that but I'm in favor of a relatively close consistency, even if not an exact replication of IMF rules in the United States.
Okay, Patrick.
I had the great good fortune to have been. Is it on? Yeah. I have the great good fortune. Oh, I'm Pat Malloy. I had the great good fortune to have been general counsel of the Senate Banking Committee in 1988 when the Congress wrote this law. We worked with Chairman Proxmire, Senator Garn, Senator Hines, Senator Sarbanes were the key guys who were behind this. And they were acting pursuant to the constitutional authority given them, and then enacted the law because they themselves in the Congress couldn't do this work. They delegated it to the Treasury. And because the Treasury failed to carry out its duties and didn't act as a good agent, now we have enormous imbalances which have built up in the system, and then everybody runs around saying Congress is going protectionist. Well, there's a reason they're going protectionist, because they're hearing from the constituents that they're getting wiped out. $800 billion current accounts surplus. So I think you've performed a very important service, because what you've done is you've shown how the law was enacted and the fact that the agencies failed to carry out their responsibilities, and have given new guidance for the Congress, which represents the people, to go back and look at this and decide whether there aren't some remedies. So I salute you for what you've done.
Thank you for that. Steve, you want to pass it back, Pat?
Stephen Collins, Automotive Trade Policy Council. Thank you also. I think it's been a fascinating history for those of us who've dabbled in and out of this to see the debate framed really as the constitutional separation of powers on this question as it's lived through the debate, the reporting requirements since '88. Looking at just the events of the last year, for those of us who have been here at Fred's house looking at these questions, there seems to be a bit of a stalemate, if you will, on some of it. On the one hand, you've got the reporting requirement and the reporting sequence from Treasury kind of having hit the wall. They're fairly discounted. They're not taken very seriously, fairly or not, anymore. They were seen, I think, by many as the Treasury just trying to keep Congress at bay, keep them happy. On the other hand, the Congress then did say, let's go beyond '88. And last year, the Banking Committee had a bill, the Finance Committee had a bill, which many of the ideas that you are in your, in terms of the evolution of the discussion that are reflected in your book, are reflected in those bills as well, but they're stuck. And they seem to be stuck, I think, partially out of either because some of these currencies have appreciated, or because there's been a fear of this is protectionism, this is China bashing or whatever. So they've been, the Banking and Finance Committee bills got stuck. Then I remember Tim Adams in the last several years before he left giving a series of speeches saying, let's get the IMF into this designation business. And it was sort of like whether that was the intention or not, it was like, let Mikey do it. Let's get this off of our back and get the IMF into it. And we had the IMF principles come out. So there's action in each of those particular silos, but it seems to have plateaued in the last year since then. Just your comment on that, just taking it to where you see it today. from the Congress, from where Treasury is, and from on the IMF side?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, yeah, thank you for that. I think there are a couple things going on. In terms of the momentum behind these bills. First of all, there was a jurisdictional dispute, especially on the Senate side, between the Finance Committee and the Banking Committee about whose bill should move forward, and that was a snag that delayed things. I think that kind of snag could be overcome if the larger politics kind of were compelling. But I think members on both sides, but kind of especially in the House, when the action moved potentially to the House Ways and Means Committee in the wintertime, there was a lot of concern about moving this type of legislation when the dollar had been depreciating and in the midst of the financial fallout from the subprime crisis. And in that environment, members had pause about moving this because they didn't want to be tagged or blamed for any further depreciation of the dollar, or be accused of ganging up on the dollar and pushing it lower. So that's why I say that now that if the dollar, if its depreciation against the euro and yen has halted for the time being, or if it appreciates kind of further against these currencies, well, then I think the attitude, and if the financial fallout from the subprime crisis kind of dissipates in time, okay, then I think the calculation within Congress about the relative cost and benefits of moving this legislation shifts. If there are larger Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, then it becomes possible for Democrats to act. And if there is a Democratic president who's endorsed two of these bills, it's more plausible that it could be signed rather than vetoed. So if in January, February, March of next year we see the Chinese current account surplus continuing to be large or even increasing, then I think the atmosphere for moving this legislation the atmosphere could favor moving this legislation, and we could see it come to fruition. So I think the recommendations that I make here could eventually be actionable, though I wouldn't see movement between now and the election.
Let me just add one point, if I might. As several of you have noted, Randy has addressed this topic in a rather profound way, going back to the Constitution, looking at the relation between Congress and the executive branch. I think there's another profound underpinning of the issue. The whole objective, assuming for the moment we agree, though there's some views to the contrary, that the Chinese currency is substantially undervalued and is adding to the international imbalances. The ultimate objective of the exercise is to get China to act. And Randy said in his remarks, like most of us would agree, having the U.S. move unilaterally in this way is a third or fourth best. The global system should have rules that could be implemented in strong, clear cases like this. One of the problems in getting that to be done is the question of the legitimacy of the international system itself. And we know, much as we may love the IMF and the WTO and the institutions, that they have not kept up. We've had many meetings on that here in this building. That those institutions simply have been losing their political legitimacy, in part because they don't adequately represent the current makeup of the world economy. In your handout package today, I included an article that I've written in the new issue of Foreign Affairs that tries to address that in the China context, and really notes that China, through its recalcitrance on the currency and a lot of other things, is really challenging the international economic order. And one reason for that, which I would say has some legitimacy, is that it was not in at the creation. It is a global economic superpower. yet it is not playing much of a role in the management and implementation of the global economic system. And as we get into big new systemic issues like climate change, sovereign wealth funds, where we're creating new international rules, I argue China ought to be hand in hand with the U.S., I call it a G2, to really be there at the creation, create rules, because if China doesn't contribute positively and constructively to both creating those rules and implementing them, we're not going to have much of a system. As much as you can apply that concept to existing rules of the road, it would be desirable. So in that sense, there is also a profound problem at the international side to go along with the profound problem on the domestic side. That's not today's topic, but I did want to mention that because it's a really, I think, very important element in the picture, and it's part of the reason that we're driven toward third or fourth best solutions rather than attacking the issue in the proper way, which is through multilaterally agreed rules of the game that ought to apply. Note, incidentally, the dramatic difference between the modern, at least more modern, WTO and the unreformed IMF, where the creation of the WTO eliminated the possibility that a country could veto action against itself. And that's why the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO is reasonably effective. In the IMF, you still veto action against yourself. And the Chinese are doing it right now, even in the completion and publication of the Article 4 consultations that address this issue. But it's because the IMF rules are way behind the game. So that's part of the problem. Goes beyond Randy's approach, but I did want to mention it. Okay, there were a number of hands up here. Yeah, right here.
Hi, I'm Jeff Hammond. I'm Senator Schumer's trade and economic policy staffer. So a good measure of, I guess, what we're talking about here today is either to my boss's credit or my boss's fault, depending on your perspective. I had a question about some of the recommendations you had. One of the main reasons that the Baucus-Grassley-Schumer-Graham bill took the approach of rewriting the whole 88 Act section that pertains to manipulation and then also putting in the trade sanctions language is because even if you change the language in the 88 Act to make it more easy to cite China for manipulation, like the Banking Committee's approach did, that all that happens is you're supposed to have expedited bilateral negotiations, which by all intents and purposes should already be occurring through the SED or some other venue. And that was the real stumbling block that we had is, so you have expedited negotiations. If China doesn't want to do anything, China's not going to want to do anything. I mean, so what if you have sped up negotiations, right? So that's why we wanted to do something that really focused on trade, which led to the jurisdictional problem everybody's talking about partially banking, partially finance, and I can go into why the bills haven't moved. But I just wanted to get your response to that.
Well, I'm sympathetic with those that want to find some kind of compelling fulcrum on which to leverage these negotiations, right? And so so that's why, kind of in the book, I discuss the deployment of these countermeasures favorably. Okay, despite kind of accusations from the other side, kind of that this is protectionism, right? I don't regard it as protectionism when it's addressing, when it's correcting or rectifying a huge distortion in the international monetary and trading system that's brought about by government intervention on the other side. But at the same time, kind of I've listed a couple of caveats to observe when we introduce these measures, and that was kind of the focus of kind of part of the presentation there. I want to follow up with on this issue of China and Chinese domestic politics kind of for a second, extending some of the comments kind of that Fred made about its relationship to the international system. There are people in China that understand this problem. And there are people in China that understand that a faster appreciation of the renminbi will help them fight the problem of domestic liquidity creation and inflation. But those people are distinctly in the minority. and they don't hold sway kind of over policy. Now, there are a couple of things that could give them a stronger hand in the domestic political debate within China. One is a further increase in the rate of Chinese inflation. Abba Iban once said that he had infinite faith in man's ability to be rational after he exhausts all other possibilities. Well, at some point, the Chinese are going to discover that in order to fight the inflation problem, they're going to have to stop intervening and buying kind of large amounts of dollars. Kind of the second thing that can help change the debate kind of within China, I don't think a rational argument about among academics is going to do it. The second thing that can change the debate in China is the reaction on the part of the rest of the world, either in multilateral fora like the IMF, or in terms of trade reaction, in terms of the countermeasures and sanctions that are embodied in some of these bills. That can help change the debate within China.
Thank you. Frank Varga with the NAM. Randy, a real excellent book, and as you know, the NAM has wrestled with this, and we've been very critical of the Treasury for not citing China. But looking at the practical end, and you're very brave for trying to get into that with the countermeasures, you note that once you have a finding of manipulation, it doesn't do any good just to say, well, won't you end your manipulation? And you note that the IMF, and as Fred has reinforced, doesn't really have the teeth. So you look at domestic countermeasures, but you appear to have ruled out an across-the-board approach like the Schumer-Graham approach of 27.5%, saying that's not WTO legal and is a blunt tool. And you seem to look with some favor on adding on a currency manipulation part to countervailing duties or anti-dumping. But those are micro tools. And some would say, they're expensive for industry to use, and they can get down to pretty... It's difficult to get a whole broad swath of imports covered by them, so it would take a lot of those cases, I think, to make an impression on China or whoever the country that is manipulating in order to get them to say, whoa, there's so much pressure here, we have to do something about it. Did you think of anything else? Is there anything else on the menu, or is it basically those are the two choices?
Well, the list of measures in these kind of bills is pretty long. There may be other things out there that these bills don't contemplate or that I haven't thought of, but no, I haven't come up with kind of other bright ideas kind of beyond kind of what's envisioned here. There is a suggestion in some of these bills that if China kind of refuses to desist, that the Federal Reserve Board Chairman and the U.S. Treasury Secretary should sit down and consult about the possibility of a counter-intervention in the foreign exchange market. So there are, we could envision other things, but the focus of the book, you're right, is on these countermeasures, and I think that I would rather take an approach which could possibly be, which is arguably WTO consistent, even if it's less ambitious than an approach like the across-the-board 27.5% tariff on all Chinese imports, which is kind of patently WTO inconsistent. At least these other routes stand the test, even if they may be applied in a sector-specific way as cases move through the system. These others at least have the have the possibility of withstanding challenge within the WTO. And Gary Huffbauer and Claire Brunel, in their analysis in the China exchange rate book, argue that the anti-dumping approach probably has the least is probably the more viable of the two, at least as WTO rules are concerned.
Yeah, but Randy, as you mentioned in your original remarks, there is one more possibility, Frank, that Gary mentioned in the book. That is taking China into the WTO under Article 15.4, which essentially says a country should not offset the impact of trade liberalization under the WTO system by currency undervaluation. That would require the WTO to go to the IMF to get a finding that China was violating that currency undervaluation criterion. But if it did, it would then permit action under the legal framework of the WTO against China as a whole, which you then could envisage some kind of across-the-board measure. Now, note that's dramatically different from these proposals for the U.S. to apply anti-dumping and countervailing duty actions, micro actions, against China. If the U.S. did that, then China would have to take the U.S. to the WTO. Because China would argue the U.S. was acting in violation of WTO, it would take us. And some people kind of like the idea that it would take 2 or 3 years for those cases to run through, and in the meanwhile you'd have some action, and it would signal, and probably signal to the markets and lots of other things, so it might have some impact. But it is radically different from what I think Gary prefers, actually, which is this Article 15 approach, which is both macro and has us taking them in for their alleged violation of the trade rules, requiring in turn a finding by the IMF. So, I mean, that is the alternative course. I don't think that's embodied in any of the legislative proposals.
Oh, Article 15.4 is in the banking bill.
Is in the banking bill. Well, that's actually the preferred approach that has come out of this building to this date. Yeah.
International Advisory Services Group. That was part of our 301 that we took to the administration.
Yes.
We only took it one time. The Congress did the rest. I'm speaking for the China Currency Coalition, of what the predecessor did that. But what's the difference, Fred? I understand what you say, but what's the difference between China blocking, or any other country for that matter, blocking an adverse Article 4 report, which is, let's say, without consequences? Why would they not, block the IMF decision, the definitive, the thing on which the rest of the case will hinge? How in the world are they ever going to agree to that? I mean, it seems to me you run into a dead end if you go down that road.
Big practical problems. Look, but as you know, because you wrote briefs on this, this is uncharted terrain in both the WTO and the IMF. So hypothetically, somebody takes a case to the WTO. We don't quite know how it would behave, but let's say it got far enough to ask the IMF for a finding. The IMF would have to decide how it responded. Now, that should at least trigger a big debate within the IMF. And there is no, to my knowledge, there's no clear decision-making process in the IMF on this. The executive, and it's not even clear whether the executive board, I'm looking at Nancy, former USED, Sam, also former USED, I think it's not clear how the IMF would render its opinion. Would it be by the executive board, where China or anybody else could veto it, or would it be a staff analysis?
Well, it wouldn't be necessarily it wouldn't be, it's not specified as requiring a high vote.
Okay.
So if it goes to the board, presumably.
All right, so we get an assurance here from former EDs that it would be a majority vote because it's not, right,
It's a board decision.
it's not an issue that requires a heavily weighted majority. So anyway, so Charles, so the answer is it's not clear, but because it is uncharted terrain, and Gary always stresses that in his work, but that it's not so obvious that it could not proceed. One final, we're past our witching hour, but this is fascinating. So one last commentary.
I'm Casey Peabody. I'm Senator Bunning's trade counsel. And first of all, I want to say I really appreciate the work that went into this book. This is something that Senator Bunning has been very concerned with, is these reports and the apparent failure of the administration to apply the 88 Act the way it was intended. In fact, we have a bill that I noticed you might want to add to your list. It's Senate 2813. What the bill would do is make a congressional finding that China is manipulating its currency and require Treasury to take the steps already spelled out in Senate 1677, which is the banking bill. But I just wanted to say thank you for doing this, and I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you for bringing that bill to our attention.
Okay, we are past our witching hour. I thank you all for coming. I want to again thank Randy for addressing this set of issues, doing so in a courageous way, and I'm sure this will not be the last discussion we'll have on this one, nor the last we will all hear of this particular debate. Randy, thank you. Thanks to all. Meeting adjourned.